Okay, then, last time we went in and we finished up our shifters of the demand curve. And so you have those listed in your notes. We're going to go ahead and set those aside right now. And today what I want to do is finish up the shifters of the supply curve and then go in and start to bring this entire analysis back together again. So we then go in and do some supply and demand examples, watch what happens, put the market back together, and watch what happens with our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantities. All right, so let's go in then and let's get started by going in and drawing an initial supply curve. So remember, up until now, when we've gone in and we've looked at the supply curve, all we've done is draw an upward sloping supply curve, and all we've done is mark it with an S. And so every supply curve that we've drawn has looked exactly the same way. Well, now I want you to go in and mark it with an S naught. Because again, we know that these curves are going to be shifting around now, and we need to know where they start and where they finish. So if we go in and we have one of these things in the economy, go in and let's see, let me back up. Let me say I tell you that there has been a decrease in supply. A decrease in supply. So what that means is that the entire supply curve is going to shift to the left. The entire supply curve will shift to the left. So what I want you to do then in your model is to go in and draw yourself a supply curve, mark it with an S1, and this entire thing shifts back and to the left. Now, I do want to make it clear here because some people go in and get confused when it's talking about the supply curve. When I go in and I draw this arrow back into the left, that means that regardless of what the price is, sellers are going to be willing and able to sell fewer of the goods than they did before. But some people will go in, don't put this in your notes. Some people will go in and they will interpret this as, hey, we started here and then we went to here and they draw the line that way. And that is incorrect because that would actually be showing the supply curve is not decreasing. What does it look like it's doing? It's going up, right? It looks like it's going the opposite direction. And so that is a completely different and wrong interpretation of what is going to be happening in these scenarios. So when you go in and you draw a decrease in supply, I want you to have that supply curve shifting back into the left, not up in this direction. Okay, and then the same thing goes if you're going in and dealing with an increase in supply. So you have your price and your quantity. And again, draw yourself a supply curve with an S naught to start. So if I go in then and tell you that there has been an increase in supply, then what this shows is the entire supply curve is going to shift to the right. The entire supply curve is going to shift out into the right. So in your analysis then, you would take your supply curve and you would shift it out horizontally in that direction. Again, you'll get yourself confused if you think about the supply curve going this way, right? That would kind of imply that supply is decreasing because it's going down. That's not what's happening. That supply curve is shifting out in this direction, which you can show if you draw your lines on it, that sellers are willing and able to sell more of the product regardless of what that going market price actually is. Okay, so in this particular analysis, it's very important to go in and keep in mind, and that'll keep it straight on which way you're supposed to shift that particular curve. Okay, is everybody good with this? All right, so let's go ahead regardless. Let's go ahead and let's start off with all of our shifters of the supply curve. It turns out for the most part, mostly supply is harder to deal with than demand. On the shifters, I think it's a little bit easier to deal with. So let's go in and let's mark this under the shifters of supply. All right. So the first shifter of the supply curve is going to be the number of sellers or firms in a market. The number of sellers or firms in a market. So we're talking about the actual physical number of businesses, right, that are going in and selling those particular products. So if you have an increase in the number of firms selling a particular product, then you would show that in your analysis as an increase in supply. So that supply curve then would shift out into the right. I think that makes more sense. It makes good sense. The more sellers you have, the more the product is available, regardless of what the market price actually is. All right. If you have firms leave the market, or a decrease in the number of firms, and we'll talk about this one when we get to some of our examples. So as the number of firms goes down in your model, you would show that as your supply curve shifting back into the left. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one, I think, is just as equally easy to deal with, and that is resource prices. Remember when we first started supply analysis, we were going in and I was asking the question, well, what are all the pieces of information that a business has available to them? Right? And we went through the idea of how much do they have to sell? What did they pay for the product? What is their profit motivation and all that other kind of stuff? Well, what they actually paid for the product would come under the idea of resource prices. So if you are the maker of the refrigerator, right, then you would know how much it costs for the Freon, for the fiberglass, right, for the motors and insulation and all that other stuff. On the retail side, then you would know how much you actually paid initially for the refrigerator. Then you do your markup and then you go out and sell it and make a profit. Either way, whether it's at the wholesale or the retail side, that's what we call resource prices. So what you have is, if you have an increase in resource prices, what that means is you cannot supply as many of the goods as you did at the going market price. So as resource prices go up, that is analogous to supply decreasing. Thus, the higher resource prices go, the further back and to the left your supply curve is going to shift. All right. On the other hand, if you have a decrease in resource prices, then the good is now cheaper and easier to make than it was before. So therefore, you can sell more of it regardless of the going market price. And so that constitutes an increase in supply. So as resource prices go down, that supply curve is going to shift itself out into the right. All right, makes sense? Very straightforward. The third one is going to be technology. Specifically production technology that we've been talking about since we were talking about the production possibilities frontier. Guys, technology, we know, makes it cheaper, makes it easier to produce goods and services, and technology only works in one direction. Either you have it or you don't. So when you go out and you increase technology, then you increase that supply curve, and that supply curve will shift out into the right. So there's only one for that one because technology only increases, it never decreases. And actually, to see this, one of the most prominent places it occurs in a number of different industries, but the car production industry is one that you can really, really see this over this period of time. So if you go in and you start talking about automobiles, for an example, if you go back in and you look at the early part of the 1920s with Henry Ford's Model T Ford, you would go in and you would have a supply curve for that Model T Ford that is way back, let's put this as 1920s, way back into the left, right? Again, a lot of people look at that and say, well, isn't that very high supply? No, because if you start drawing the lines, the quantities are going to be very, very low, right? And so the supply curve being far to the left, it's a very low supply environment. But let's go in and let's just say, for an example, we're at the very bottom of this, and one of these Model T Fords is selling for whatever, $500. And in the early days of production, Henry Ford may have only been able to produce 10,000 cars per year at that $500. If you know anything about the car production back in the 1920s, and you've seen pictures or videos, each one of these cars was almost literally made they were handmade, but they were made one by one. Right? There was no assembly line process that was going on back in the 1920s. So it was a very, very low production output. But what happened was, as we got into the 1930s and 40s, particularly with the advent of electricity brought about the production assembly line process. It brought about air compressors. So now instead of going in and putting bolts in by hand, you can now do it with air tools and do it a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. So as technology increased, then you went in and you had an increase in supply by the 1940s of this automobile. So what this shows is that as that supply curve shifts out and to the right, even if the price of a car stayed at $500, instead of being able to produce only 10,000 cars, they would have been able to produce 100,000 cars per year. Right? And then from there, now you go in and you have that many cars rolling off the assembly line by noon, right, at any particular plant. So as technology goes up, that's a good thing, and it's going to turn out for the supplier and for the consumer as that demand or as that supply curve goes in and shifts itself out into the right. By the way, has anybody ever had a chance to go through, take a tour through a car production plant at all? No. One of these days I'm gonna have to get a bus together. We sure can't do it now because of COVID. But actually either maybe go to Kansas City or I believe, bless you, there's a production plant in Oklahoma City. I went through this has been a few years ago now, but I got to go through the Chevrolet the Chevrolet truck production plant back in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's actually quite a thing to watch an automobile go from nothing but a frame, and that's it, right? And follow this thing all the way down the line until about 2 hours later, they're literally driving it out the door. Right? It is just an absolute amazing process. As we were going through this entire thing, do you know what they told us the hardest job in the plant was? Now think about putting a car together, right, from start to finish and all the things that are involved in putting a car together or a truck, right? What do you think the hardest job in the plant was? I wouldn't have guessed it. It's putting on the lug nuts. Think about that one for a second. Putting on the lug nuts, right? And the reason it's so hard is that you have to go in. They don't put them on one at a time. They have a machine that goes in and does it. So you go in, they have these huge bins of lug nuts. So if a truck's coming down, they're up in the air, of course, at that time, and the wheels are hanging on the hubs. Some guy will go over, grab a whole handful, and they'll stick it into a machine. It's got either 6 to 8 sockets, depending on the truck, right? And they'll go in and they'll put those lug nuts in. And this thing's suspended from the ceiling, and he will go in and he'll move this thing up and down, and he'll follow the truck along until he gets them lined up. And then he pushes a button and all of those sockets spin at the same time. And it goes on and puts all the lug nuts on all at one time and torques them to specifications. Right. This guy was really good. I wanted to try it. They wouldn't let me because, if you go in and you cross thread something, you're screwed at that point in time. Right. But this guy was really, really good at what he did to get everything lined up and not mess up the process of doing it. But then he had to do all 4 wheels in less than a minute and a half. Think about that one. Right. If you're at home and you're rotating your tires, how long does it take to take the lug nuts off and put them back on and rotate your tires? Eternity, right? I mean, it really does. This person goes in and is able to put all the lug nuts on and torque them to specifications in less than a minute and a half, right? And he has to do it consistently without messing it up. That's the hardest job in the plant. So when you go in and you start looking at these supply curves, a lot of them over periods of time have really shifted out and to the right. All right, very good. I'll stop waxing poetic about that one. Number 4, then, is going to come under the prices of related goods. Now, remember, we had something like this when we were dealing with the demand curve. And we were going in, and from the demander's point of view, right, we had both the complements and the substitutes that we were dealing with. Well, not only is that true of the demand side, it's true of the production side as well. So there's 2 of these we're going to deal with. And the first one I will call substitutes. Substitutes in production. Now, I want you to notice that I've been very specific about this term, substitutes in production. So if I say something is a substitute good, you're dealing with it from the demand side. When you see, if I say something is a substitute in production, then that in production makes you, or should make you think that we're dealing with this from the supplier's point of view. So I'm trying to make a clear distinction between the 2. So a substitute in production is an alternative to another product using the same factors of production. Give me a second to write that down. So alternative to another product using the same or nearly the same factors of production. When I say using the same, it does not have to be a 100% switch. It does not have to be a 100% switch. And what I mean by that is you can consider corn and soybeans as substitutes in production, because you can use the same land to grow either corn or soybeans. The same farmer can grow corn or soybeans. You can use the same tillage equipment, the same spraying equipment, right, so on and so forth. Sometimes the pesticides and herbicides are maybe a little bit different. You can use the same sprayer, but you can't use the same pesticides. And clearly, you cannot plant corn seed and get soybeans that comes up out of the ground, right? So your initial input is going to be different as well. But a big chunk of the factors of production can be used to produce one or the other. Okay, so what I am going to assume, let's say that we are a shoe manufacturer. And as a shoe manufacturer, we can go in and we can produce 2 products. We can either produce tennis shoes or we can produce boots. All right, so price, quantity, price, quantity. All right, so we can produce either or. And again, these are pretty close factors of production because the same plant can be used to produce either tennis shoes or boots. The same labor force, the same sewing machines, dyeing machines, whatever. But there are several obviously changes to being able to produce a tennis shoe or a boot. But they are very, very close substitutes in production. So what I want you to do in this case is go in and draw yourself an upward sloping supply curve for tennis shoes, mark it with an S, and an upward sloping supply curve of boots, mark it with S naught. Okay, so again, just to refresh our memories, what we're trying to get at here, if there is a change in the price of tennis shoes, what's going to happen to the supply of boots, right? That's what we're looking for here. So let's assume right now these particular tennis shoes that we have, let's say they are currently selling for $25 a piece, a pair. And at $25 a pair, given everything that this shoe manufacturer knows about their business, let's say they would be willing to produce 25,000 pairs of tennis shoes. Okay, let's just say this happens to be tennis shoes for one of the sporting stars, right, that are out there. They, normally a lot of the big stars come out with their own line of tennis shoes. Well, as those tennis shoes become more popular, the price of those tennis shoes increases. So let's say they go from $25 a pair up to $75 a pair. Well, as the price of tennis shoes goes up, the quantity supplied of tennis shoes increases. So let's say they go from 25,000 up to 75,000 pairs of tennis shoes. So the quantity supplied of tennis shoes increases. But the question becomes, what happens to the supply of boots? Do you think it would go up or do you think it would go down? So as the price of tennis shoes goes up, the seller is willing and able to sell more tennis shoes. But how do you think that's ultimately going to affect the supply of boots? It'll go down. Could you tell me why, Jeremiah?
More resources going towards tennis shoes, less resources going towards boots.
That is perfect. That is absolutely perfect. I want you to think that of this particular seller having a production possibilities frontier. They only have so many resources to produce either tennis shoes or boots. So tennis shoes would be up here, boots would be down here. Right now, at the price of $25, given the price of boots and tennis shoes, the seller is going to offer 25,000 pairs of tennis shoes for sale. So right now, let's just say that happens to be right here. So there's, no, that's wrong. That's too high, sorry. Let's go in and let's go down to here. All right, so point A, so we have 25,000 pairs of tennis shoes and however many boots this seller is actually offering for sale. All right, so right now that's where they're actually operating. Now, what's going to happen here is as the price of those tennis shoes goes up, tennis shoes are going to become more profitable than boots. So they're going to shift resources over into tennis shoe production such that tennis shoe production increases to 75,000 pairs. But the fact is, something has to give somewhere, and that give happens to be in boot production, so boot production will actually decline. So as it does, that supply curve for boots will shift itself back and to the left. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so the rule that we are going to use here is, can't spell today, as the price of a substitute increases, the supply of its substitute, in this case, boots, will decrease. And thus that supply curve then will shift back into the left. Switch. Okay, does everybody see how the rule follows along from my graph? Is everybody okay with that? All right, and again, now the exact opposite of this is going to happen as well. So as the price of a substitute decreases, the supply of its substitute will increase. And thus that supply curve, as the price of those tennis shoes goes down, now boots are relatively more profitable. The seller will go in and substitute back into the more profitable commodity, and thus the supply curve will shift out into the right. Okay. Questions? Again, that's the first step of the problem. We'll be going in and we'll be putting this all together next time. And then finally, the last shifter of the supply curve is going to be, see, this is going to be number 5, which is going to be technology. Oh, that's wrong. I had that one. It's going to be natural disasters and other weather problems. Natural disasters and other weather problems. Now, I want you to understand that when you're going in and you're looking at this one, hang on, let me, I've got my camera off just a little bit. For everybody watching that. Look out. Oh, that's why. Why won't it come over? There we go. Going in and actually looking at the way I have it written in and of itself, natural disasters, other weather problems, it just looks like that can't be anything good, which it isn't. So when you have natural disasters, hurricanes, early frost, floods, what have you, any other weather problems, that's always going to decrease supply. Whether it be manufacturing, we're just not going in and talking about commodities. We're also going in and talking about manufacturing as well. Because when you go in and you have these natural disasters and things are destroyed, then you go in and you simply can't do as much production as you did before. Right? So both of those kind of work in the same direction. All right, questions, and that's it. That's the shifters of the supply curve. So hopefully, like I said, they're fairly easy in nature. All right, so what I would like to do then, let's go ahead and let's get started going in, since we have just a little bit of time, introducing the idea of going in and putting our supply and our demand curves back together. All right, so when you go in and you start working on a problem like this, the very first thing you want to do is to go in and draw yourself an overall market before you get started doing anything else. And what I mean by that is most of the time when you get started, you're not going to know exactly what's going to be changing in this market. So when you go in and you start working on this, before you do anything, draw yourself a market that looks like this. You have your price and quantity, your downward sloping demand curve, mark it with a D naught, your upward sloping supply curve, mark it with an S naught. And then I want you to go in and you have your equilibrium price, which is going to be right here. Most of the time, I am not going to actually list an equilibrium price. Sometimes I do, the vast majority of the time I don't. Because as it turns out, we're not so interested necessarily in the equilibrium, the price itself, as we actually are going on and seeing what happens to the equilibrium. Does it go up or does it go down? All right, so I just want you to mark it with a P naught that will denote your equilibrium. And then I want you to mark this with a Q naught, right, denoting your equilibrium quantity. And so at that stage of the ball game, then, that is always the analysis that you should go in and you should start with. All right. Then from there, you're going to want to start asking yourself a series of questions. The first one is this a price change only? Is this a price change only? So what that means is when you go in and you start reading the problem, it's going to state that the price is either above equilibrium or the price is below equilibrium. So the price is above / below equilibrium, because it will go in and it will state that specifically. And so that's when you go in, you start drawing, and then you figure out whether there's a shortage or a surplus or so on. All right, so be looking for that terminology specifically. If you don't see that show up, then number two, ask yourself, is there a price floor or a price ceiling that was mentioned? If there was, draw it, do the analysis, and ask yourself, is there a shortage, surplus, or neither? Now, if it doesn't say anything about a price floor or price ceiling, then you ask yourself, is it a demand shifter? And I want you to go through, start going through your notes and looking to see whatever is listed here, does this show up under the demand side? And if it is, identify it, read your rule, and then go in and make the appropriate move in your market. If you can't find it under the demand side, then it could be a supply shifter. And again, you go through exactly the same process. You want to identify what that shifter is, and then you want to go in and read your rule, and then go in and, hang on for a second, and then you want to go ahead and make your appropriate move. All right, let me share my screen here for just a moment. This one, and share. All right, so the first example, I'm going to have a handout for you next time to be able to go in and work on these just a little bit. We're going to do some more examples next time, but I want you to get started. This is the type of thing that you're going to be looking at to be able to figure out what's going to happen to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity of this particular commodity. So according to this one, here's what you've read in the newspaper. Assume the economy is in a period of expansion and incomes are on the rise. So what will happen to the price and quantity of houses in the United States? Okay, so this then, we've already drawn the market for houses. We have our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity, whatever that may be. I didn't state it in the problem, so it doesn't really matter. If you want to put it on there, put it on there. All right, now I want you to look at what is written there and then come back here and ask yourself, is this a price change only that has happened in the market? So in other words, anywhere in that problem does it say anything about the price being above or below equilibrium? Is that stated whatsoever? And the answer is no. That terminology never shows up in here. All right, so this is not going to be it. Did I mention anything about a price floor or a price ceiling? Nope, nothing there, so we can skip that one. I want you to open your notes to your demand shifters. And I want somebody to tell me, what was that first demand shifter that we talked about?
Number of buyers.
The number of buyers or population. Did I say anything about a population change here? No, that's not it. What was number 2? Income. Did I say anything about income in this problem? As a matter of fact, I did. Assume the economy is in a period of expansion and incomes are on the rise. So income is a demand shifter. So if income goes up, what happens to demand? It goes up, which means that it moves in which direction? To the left or to the right? To the right, right? So if we have an increase in demand, the demand curve will shift out and to the right. So in your model, I want you to go in and draw yourself a new demand curve, call it D1, that shifts out and to the right. Now, I want you to notice logistically what has happened here. We started out on this demand curve, but now as demand increases, the blue demand curve does not exist anymore, correct? It's not there. I'm going to leave it there because I want to know where we started, but it no longer exists. This demand curve is now pushed out and to the right. And now we've come to a new equilibrium price. Well, what happened to that equilibrium price? Did it go up or did it go down? It went up, right? And what happened to equilibrium quantity? It increased as well. Guys, let the model do the work for you, right? Graph it out, go through this process of trying to identify what kind of shifter we have. Once you get it identified, take your rule, apply it to your graph, and then determine from the graph what happens to equilibrium price and quantity. So this would be the correct graph to go along with the scenario that I had on the board. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Okay, that's what we're going to be shooting for. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it there for today. And then